In the early morning, on the 30th of May, 2005, Memorial Day, 80 miles northeast of Baghdad, a shooting star was crashing its way towards Earth. It was only there for a flash. It was thousands of miles away. I never saw it. I never heard it. I never could have dreamed it. But the only sound I heard to even know it happened were the words from a friend the next day. Did you hear about Casey? 2 months earlier, my friend Casey Crate and I had been together in Afghanistan. As I jumped down from the ramp of one of our Spectre gunships, a fleet of Toyota Tacomas and SUVs came to an abrupt halt near our staging area. From the bed of one of the trucks, my friend dismounted. Like his colleagues, he was armed to the teeth, wore a parachute on his back, but what separated him from his bearded friends was that he wore his typical unbreakable smile, coursing from ear to ear. For me, this is just another deployment, but for Casey, this was different. This is his first time out as a combat controller. After nearly 2 years of grueling training in the combat control pipeline, where he and his colleagues are sharpening the tip of the Air Force's spear, Casey had been brought up to the pros. He was having the time of his life. He looked less like the highly trained warfighter and lethal warfighter that he was, and more like a kid who had been brought up from the sidelines and been asked by the adults to join them on the field. The giddiness on his face was almost infectious. Nearly laughing myself, I ironically asked, "Hey Casey, what are you up to?" Without a second of hesitation, he proudly piped out, "We're going to jump out of airplanes and catch bad guys." I saw him again a few weeks later and coming out of the chow tent. We made plans for when we returned to the United States, and I almost asked to get a picture together, but figured we'd have plenty of time when we got back to Florida. Did you hear about Casey? I assumed he was back and had already started into his antics. Almost laughing, I said, "No. What's up?" My friend Jason now realized it'd be his job to tell me. His face became ashen, almost stone-like. "He's gone, bro. He's gone." That day in 2005 would be what I now see as my first Memorial Day. A few weeks later, from a helicopter hangar on Herbert Field, the reality set in. He was gone. I felt the 21-gun salute in a way that I'd never felt before. As the crisp snaps of the rounds were fired, a shock ripped through me. Each preceding round of volleys felt like bolts of lightning, seizing me from the top of my head, shaking me down through my bones before tearing through my chest and exiting at the bottom of my boots. Until Casey's death, I had not understood why the old veterans had marched in their parades, why they wore their caps, or why many of them always seemed so serious and stoic. Casey's death, as I suspect for many of you here who've lost family members and friends over there, made me question everything. It made me question why God would take a person who seemed to have been placed on this earth for the sole benefit and welfare of others. It made me question why he volunteered to go forward from Afghanistan to Iraq when he was supposed to have beat me home. And it made me question why we were fighting in places I hadn't previously been able to place on a map. The more I sought to understand and the more I learned, the less I blindly trusted those in leadership positions and the system as a whole. Through this reflection, I learned that everyone from the combat commanders selected to leave our friends in combat to our elected officials and even our commander-in-chief, all are human, all are flesh, all are fallible. I suspect it was Casey's death that always led me to ask the right questions, to always seek understanding, and when a problem faced me in the future and something wasn't right, to confront it. When I arrived at campus at the University of Michigan in 2007, the transition was not easy. Just as we'd been surprised with the war in Afghanistan, it seemed the country was just as surprised with our return. I asked the university why they did not have programs for veterans. And when I did not get the right answers, it fueled me to action. When I dug deeper, I realized the problems were much bigger than just at the University of Michigan. And this led me to starting Student Veterans of America to ensure that other veterans didn't have to struggle as my colleagues and I did. It also led me to working alongside Bob Wallace, the veterans of foreign wars, to help compelling Congress towards the passage of the post 9/11 GI Bill of Rights. Casey's loss was a crushing one, crushing for his family, crushing for his friends, crushing for the whole world to bear. But all of you know of a similar loss. Whether it came from machine gun fire in Korea or Europe, booby traps and rat holes in Vietnam, IEDs in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, an unexplained cancer, or an internal pain that led to a self-inflicted casualty, these losses must be for something. Aeschylus wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart until our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us through the awful grace of God." In the fall of 2008, less than a year after we founded Student Veterans of America, I received a message from one of my SVA chapter presidents. He wrote to inform me that one of his members, thereby one of my members, had killed himself. This young man's death, a person I never met, haunted me. I felt as though I were a commander and I just lost one of my troops. Even worse, I was the commander responsible for the welfare of an organization and those in it, but I was left helpless in preventing this tragedy from happening again. Throughout my tenure as the president of SVA, I fought and struggled to create programs for veterans who might be in crisis. I believe it was this struggle that led me to the Department of Veterans Affairs, where I'd build a national mental health program, all with the hope that I could make an impact and save lives. Unfortunately, it seems much of this work was in vain. I was fighting to save lives along thousands of others, but we were doing so without truly understanding the cause. Even worse, as I now know, the VA would not be taking a leadership role in ending this epidemic, instead, unintentionally contributing to it. A decade after the message from our chapter president at UC Berkeley, I found myself as a tech executive in New York City, and in short order, a failed tech startup founder. In the year following my company's failure, I found myself on a different path. No longer did I have a career that seemed to be in a meteoric rise. Instead, I was in a death spiral that only seemed to find deeper bottoms. If I had fallen from a cliff and hit the rocks below, I could only be found with a hand drill and bloodied hands as I clawed to go deeper. In my despair, I was treated for depression, but my treatment made me worse. Within a year of being placed on antidepressants, I was unemployable and barely able to maintain stable housing. At my lowest point, I came to accept that the best I would ever do again would be mowing my parents' lawn. Fortunately, suicide was not an option for me, as I'd considered the thought years earlier. But I could not bear knowing the wreckage that would be left for my family and friends. The positive, I'd survive. The negative, I was resigned to an endless stream of shocks as failure followed failure and isolation met profound sadness. A little over a year ago, I had an epiphany. Using the fingers to do the math, I counted up the list of medications the VA had me on. By the time I hit the sixth finger, I realized that my turmoil was created by the same medications that were supposed to be treating me. In that moment, I also recognized that the VA had no plan of taking me off of this cocktail. I alone would have to climb out of this electrified cage. When I tried to recount the last time I met with a VA psychologist or counselor, I couldn't. In 3 years of treatment, nearly a dozen drugs in all, 6 at a time, thousands of pills, I never once met with a VA psychologist or counselor. I was in as much shock as many of you are likely in hearing this. But what is more terrifying, and what everyone here knows, that I was not an isolated case. While this lesson in overprescribing practices at the VA is important and requires us to investigate, the true wisdom came as my withdrawal began. As I decreased the dosage of Zoloft, the antidepressant, I became rage-filled, nearly violent. I believed I was being watched, that my phone calls were being listened to, and my life was in danger. Beyond the paranoia, panic attacks, anxiety, and depression, I had physical pain to the point where I could barely walk. At its worst, I couldn't stand. My ears rang as though they were going to explode, and electrical shocks, or brain zaps, as they're called, streamed from one side of my head to the other. After nearly a month of severe pain, anxiety, and panic, an article ran in the New York Times. Many taking antidepressants discover they cannot quit. Through the stories of others, I found my own. I realized that no longer would this be a short and inspiring recovery story. Instead, it became a year-long protracted war to expel a poison that altered my body's biology. As I began to recover, I realized that my thoughts had not been normal. More importantly, I recognized what happened to me was not right and that I was not alone. The more I researched, the darker the story became. I found that contrary to what the VA is publicly reporting, the suicide rates for veterans who use the VA for their health care are 32% higher than for veterans who do not use the VA for their health care. Though I had to go to the VA's own source data to put this statistic together, which the VFW and American Legion have since fact-checked for accuracy. As shocking as that statistic might be, it fit into a theory. Veterans who use the VA for their care could be at increased risk for suicide as they have greater access to psychiatric care and therefore have a greater likelihood of being prescribed antidepressant medications, the same class of drugs that for a time made me a danger to myself and others. And it was this that could be causing the higher suicide rates for veterans at the VA. A study by researchers from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the University of Michigan showed that the first 180-day suicide rates for veterans treated with antidepressants. 5 of these drugs were found to have suicide rates of greater than 1 in 200 for the first 90 days of treatment. One drug studied, the suicide rate was over 1 in 100. In the last meeting I had with my psychiatrist, he said that in his 25 years of practice, he'd never had a patient with as many challenges with these drugs as me. I posed a question to him. Maybe I was just the one that came back. It seems I might have been. A little over 3 years ago, a young Marine veteran named Jeffrey Bowen checked into inpatient psychiatric care at the Ann Arbor VA Medical Center. After 4 days of being pumped full of medications to treat his paranoia, he believed someone was hunting him. He was discharged. 2 weeks later, he went missing. After 3 soul-crushing weeks, they finally found his body in the cab of his Bronco in a rural area, not 10 miles from the Ann Arbor VA. 3 months after his death, and having managed to survive the pain of her husband being missing and thought dead for 3 weeks, finding him and ultimately burying him, doctors felt his wife Lauren was depressed and suggested she try Zoloft. Within 2 weeks, she was having panic attacks. And in the month, she was debilitated to the point where she could not drive. To treat the panic, doctors prescribed Xanax. 3 years later, the panic attacks have subsided. Her children, 5 and 6 now, are healthy, happy, and growing. But 3 years later, she is still trapped on this drug. Every time she tries to stop after slowly weaning, the panic attacks return and her life spins into chaos again. I tell Lauren's story because she cannot be here, as she was at the Department of Veterans Foreign Wars Department of Michigan's convention. I tell her story because she knew what happened to her and her husband was not right. To do something about it, she started an annual walk in Ann Arbor to raise awareness about suicide. But she's now recognized, as has my VFW and Legion post in Ann Arbor, Graf O'Hara Post 423, the American Legion Department of Michigan, and the Michigan Department of Veterans of Foreign Wars. Awareness is not enough. In every year of the past 5 years, we have lost more than 6,000 veterans to suicide. This does not count the caregivers and spouses who might have met a similar fate. In the 5 previous years, we lost over 5,000 veterans to suicide. Just 1 year of veteran suicide deaths accounts for all of the combat deaths in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria combined, all since the wars began. We must remember all of the comrades we've lost in combat and at home. But just as we are here today in memory of those who are not here, we must learn, we must evolve, we must never forget, but in the end, we must act. We have the opportunity to save the lives of others and to end this epidemic. This year, more than 6,000 stars will continue crashing down. Instead of bright, beautiful lights, their descent is consumed in darkness. Their deaths are similar to the loss of my friend. While his burning star was that of an airplane on its final descent towards Earth, his loss was a casualty of war, as were the 6,000 lives that we will lose this year. Alongside the VFW and you as my comrades, friends, and family, I look forward to ensuring the brightness of these falling stars is blinding and all-consuming, that we make this year to be the end of the sad and painful chapter for our most beautiful community. Let us never forget our brothers, sisters, mothers, daughters, fathers, sons, family members, and friends who cannot be with us. Let their light always show us the path. God bless the veterans of foreign wars. God bless every veteran who has proudly served our nation. God bless our Gold Star families. And God bless the United States of America.